up in a neighborhood not 20 minutes from here. At that time, it was one of the poorest neighborhoods of the country. And unfortunately, our household was not an exception. The bottom floor of the house, where my room was located, had no carpeting, just cold, gray concrete. When I was about 8 years old, we were not able to pay our gas and electrical bills anymore, so we were cut off from both. Today, I would like to talk to you about poverty. However, and this may come as a surprise to some of you, I will not be talking about money. Because you see, in my youth, I quickly learned that poverty is so much more than a lack of money. So how is poverty defined? The traditional definition holds that, simply put, not having enough money to cover your basic needs. Instead, I propose a broader definition, one that includes an analysis on social class. This allows us to understand the contextual factors that both cause poverty and keep people in poverty. Let us start by taking a look at what I call the traditional definition of poverty. The World Bank considers someone to live in poverty when they are not able to meet their basic needs. In the poorest countries of the world, the poverty line lies at $1.90 a day. Here in the Netherlands, we use the welfare level of 1979 as a baseline for poverty. If you earn less than that amount, corrected for inflation, which today is about 2,100 euros a month for a family with 2 children, you are considered to be living in poverty. As we can see, this traditional definition is mostly about income levels. And yes, money is absolutely fundamental to combating and tackling poverty. Yet, we tend to focus on these financial aspects of poverty, and in doing so, we overlook the social mechanisms and consequences which put people in poverty and keep them there. For example, if we were to give the people in my neighborhood more money, they would perhaps be able to buy some more groceries. Yet, it will not provide them equal opportunities on the labor market. Fortunately, I am not the first one to come to this conclusion. The United Nations, for example, already has a slightly broader definition, which includes limited access to education and other basic services, social discrimination and exclusion, as well as the lack of participation in decision-making. A great start, but there's an important factor missing, which is representation. This is why I came up with the following definition. Being poor is not just being poor in money. It's being poor in opportunities, poor in possibilities, poor in reputation, poor in representation, and most of all, poor in power. Let's start with poverty in opportunities and possibilities. Worldwide, one of the most powerful tools to elevate people out of poverty is through education. Here in the Netherlands, we even call it the great equalizer. However, this was not my experience. I quickly felt that I did not fit into the mold of the educational system. The violence, poverty, chronic stress, and other problems that I faced at home rendered me unable to do what was asked of me. The educational system was simply not built for children like me. I was expected to do homework on a computer, which was impossible to do without electricity. I was told that good students ask questions, but I never learned that my voice mattered. I was asked to take important tests, but I did not know how to properly prepare for them. And most of all, I had nobody around me that could teach me. Both of my parents dropped out of high school, so they did not know how the system worked either. There seemed to me not an intellectual mismatch, but a cultural one. Not knowing how to navigate the educational system had nothing to do with my IQ, but rather with me not knowing how to play the game of education. The French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu wrote extensively about this cultural mismatch. He showed that important institutions in society are built on the norms and values of the dominant upper class, and this also includes education. These groups then have the power to define what is deemed important. And children of the dominant class are raised with these norms and values, and are thus better at navigating the system. Bourdieu showed that the educational system is not built to emancipate. It is built to reproduce inequality. In my first year of high school, I struggled immensely with math and quickly fell behind. I tried asking my mother, but she could not help me either. And then one day, I visited the house of a classmate. I knew that he also struggled with math, but he seemed to have cracked the code and caught up with the rest of the class. I wanted to know what his secret was. And when I entered his living room, it all became clear. Both of his parents had university degrees. They understood the homework we had, and their high-paying salaries allowed them to work fewer hours so they can spend more time helping their son. It was the first time that I felt that the cards were stacked against me. My classmate had what Bourdieu called the right cultural capital. His parents knew how the system worked and what was needed for him to succeed. I did not have the right cultural capital, and thus had to figure everything out myself. And unfortunately, the difference in cultural capital does not only influence the way that students perceive themselves and their own skills, it also influences how teachers view them. I experienced this firsthand at my second high school. Yes, second. I got expelled from the first school because I was seen as a bad influence. My second high school was a school where you would be sent to when no other schools would accept you anymore. The computers in the classrooms and the foosball table in the canteen were chained to the ground with thick iron chains. Nobody in the school had any confidence in our abilities. And when I was 15, I realized that the path that I was on would lead to me living the same life as my parents and their parents had. I dreamed of breaking the chain of intergenerational poverty. I dreamed of a life in the middle class. And I felt as if the only way that I could escape was to go to university. In my mind, people with university degrees led comfortable lives. So on the computer, I drafted myself a path through education. Being in the lower tiers of vocational education, the university could not be further away. I had to gather around 5 diplomas before I could even start, but I decided that that was exactly what I was going to do. A few hours later, I entered the classroom, and I told my teacher about my newfound master plan. She did not reply. Instead, she stared at me in silence, like she was carefully weighing the words inside her mind. And then she spoke up. "Perhaps," she said, "you should aim a little lower." And all these years later, I am still convinced that she actually meant well and tried to protect me. She was simply convinced, as were many others, that I would never succeed. And this is not merely an anecdote. In many countries, we see that youth from the lower socioeconomic classes have fewer opportunities to succeed in education. A very clear example of this effect is found right here in the Netherlands. At the end of elementary school, which is at the age of 12, students are placed in a specific track in high school. Studies systematically show that students from the lower socioeconomic classes are placed in lower tracks than their middle-class peers, independent of their central exam or their IQ scores. As you can see, educational inequality caused by poverty severely limits your opportunities and thus possibilities in life. It's also important to note that the lack of possibilities and opportunities are usually considered an issue of the individual itself. It's easy to look at average test scores of social groups and tell people in poverty to just do better. These notions are grounded in the way that we look at people in poverty. Therefore, let's move on and talk about the importance of reputation. Most societies in the world view people in poverty as people who made the wrong choices in their life or are refusing to make the right ones now. There's even an interesting irony to be found in the fact that I'm standing on this stage at all. I could have shared these ideas with you 10 years ago, but at that time, I wasn't a sociologist, an author, or lecturer at a prestigious university. I was still living in poverty. At that time, I suffered from having a low social status and thus had a bad reputation. My stories did not have the same reach or audience. Social status is a very important factor that we often tend to overlook when we talk about inequality. People in poverty do not just want money to provide for their basic needs, but to be accepted and seen as full human beings. For example, there's a very common complaint that comes up whenever a TV show shows a poor person owning a flat-screen TV. The first thing people do when they see a flat-screen TV in a poor person's home is complain that either one, our social welfare and benefits are too high, and two, that these people deserve to remain poor because of their poor choices. Because who prefers a TV over food? However, for someone like me who grew up in poverty and who understands the idea of status, wanting to own a flat screen is something that I can fully understand. Because you see, people want to have something to be proud of, to have something in their lives that makes them feel like regular people, to have something in their lives that can relieve the tension and stress of poverty, even if it's only for a few hours. There's a fantastic scholar named Cecilia Ridgway who sums up this idea perfectly. She concludes that people often want money as much for the status it brings as for its exchange value. Status divides groups into good and bad or high and low groups, with good and higher groups being the wealthier, healthier, culturally rich groups. And the bad groups are the people at the bottom of society. Looking back, I often ask myself, why did I really want to go to university? Was it the money? Sure, a little bit. Money was part of that comfortable life that I was imagining. But the main reason, the most important reason, was public recognition of my worth. And if you look at the research, it shows that inequality in status is detrimental for many areas in life, including education and the labor market. It also influences political participation, where people at the bottom of society feel that politicians in higher status groups simply do not represent them. They hardly vote in elections. The question then arises, why is there nobody that can stand up for their interests, that understands our lives beyond mere statistics? And this brings me to my next point, which is that poverty is also a lack of representation. For example, let's look at the Dutch parliament. In the Netherlands, 91% of members of parliament have a university degree, and this trend is rising and seen in most countries in the West. Research shows that because politics are dominated by these highly educated, mostly upper-class people, they also create policies built around the norms and values of their own social classes. And we can see the effects of this domination in many areas of policymaking, whether it's policies that favor homeowners over renters, tax cuts for the rich, rising tuition fees, or healthcare systems being privatized. All of these examples favor the dominant class. And in essence, it comes down to this. Politics and policy are dominated by a small group of highly educated, upper-class people who mostly serve the interests of their own social groups. It's what Natalie Geiger calls the poor political representation of the poor. So, poverty is a lack of power. Due to the lack of opportunities, possibilities, reputation, and representation, people living in poverty have no political voice and almost no power to systematically change their lives for the better. This is true for the people in the neighborhood that I grew up in. It is still true for my mother and my childhood friends. It is why so many of their lives remain unchanged, why they feel stuck and trapped within a political system that does not understand them. This is why I propose this broader definition of poverty today. We need to view poverty not merely as a financial issue, but as a power issue, rooted in social class struggles. Because people in poverty are too dependent on the upper classes to make choices that benefit their lives. That dependency, that lack of power, is as fundamental as money itself. Thank you.